Welcome to the ancient world. Last week, we journeyed through the origins of humanity in the Near East. From Sumer, laying the groundwork for writing and the wheel, to the powerful unification of ancient Egypt. But did you know? While the first Egyptian pyramids were under construction, a complex, equally monumental civilization was quietly thriving in a totally different place. Not Europe, not Asia, but the Americas. We used to believe the Olmec were the first American civilization. However, shocking new discoveries are rewriting history. In this episode, Circles and Labyrinths, we're taking an ambitious historical leap across the Atlantic to meet the Norte Chico of Peru, a mysterious, unwarlike civilization that built colossal structures at the same time as the pyramids of Giza. Then, we cross the Mediterranean to the dazzling island of Crete. There, the Minoan Civilization developed a society without an army, obsessed with art, bull leaping, and became the first European civilization to be taken down by a natural disaster. Ready to uncover these forgotten chapters of history? The ancient world begins now. Last time, we took a look at the origins of the Sumerian, Elamite, and Egyptian civilizations in the ancient Near East and North Africa. This week, I want to begin by making a significant jump across the Mediterranean and Atlantic, moving from the old world to the new. Wait a minute, did I say new? I might have jumped the gun a bit there. For many years, it was commonly believed that the first civilization to flourish in the Americas was the Olmec of Mesoamerica, around 1200 BC. This placed the Western Hemisphere on a much later trajectory toward cultural development compared to the Near East and Europe. However, recent discoveries indicate that a much earlier South American civilization, the Norte Chico of coastal Peru, predates the Olmec by more than 2,000 years. This makes the Norte Chico by far the oldest civilization in the Americas, and also one of only 6 locations worldwide where civilization emerged independently. During the period between 3200 and 2500 BC, while the Norte Chico were constructing large-scale public buildings in at least 7 settlements along the Peruvian coast, the only other comparable multi-settlement urban complex on the entire planet was the region of Sumer in Mesopotamia. As another point of comparison, the most active phase of Norte Chico construction, between 2600 and 2500 BC, coincided with the building of the Egyptian pyramids. So, what do we actually know about these early inhabitants of the Peruvian coast? Unfortunately, not as much as we'd like to. But we do know one thing. The Peruvian coast seems like a highly unlikely environment for a civilization to develop and thrive. The region is extremely arid, confined by 2 rain shadows, one created by the Andes Mountains to the east and the other by the Pacific trade winds to the west. The Atacama Desert, located just south of Peru on the Chilean coast, is literally the driest place on Earth. In some areas, rainfall has never even been recorded. However, the Peruvian coastal region is punctuated by more than 50 rivers that carry snowmelt from the Andes. The development of extensive irrigation systems utilizing these water sources was likely a key factor in the emergence of the Norte Chico. All monumental architecture discovered to date has been found in close proximity to these irrigation channels. In addition to shifting the focus of American civilization's origins from Mesoamerica to South America, the discovery of the Norte Chico also relocated the origins of South American civilization from the highlands and lowlands of the Andes, where the Chavan and later Inca held their major power centers, to the Peruvian coast. The Norte Chico is situated in north-central coastal Peru, approximately 100 miles north of Lima. It encompasses 4 coastal valleys, with sites primarily concentrated in the three that share a common coastal plain. The earliest date securely associated with a Norte Chico city is 3500 BC at Huaca Prieta, making it not only the oldest city in the Americas, but also one of the earliest cities in the world. From 3200 BC onward, large-scale settlement and construction began to occur throughout the entire region. From 2500 to 2000 BC, during the period of greatest Norte Chico expansion, population and development shifted significantly away from the coast towards larger interior sites such as Caral in the Supe Valley. Although these new sites remained heavily dependent on fish and shellfish from the Peruvian coast, cotton production in the interior likely provided some impetus for this shift. Though inedible, cotton was the most important product of Norte Chico irrigation, mainly because it was essential for producing fishing nets, which provided the marine resources vital to their diet, but also for its use in textile production. Control over cotton allowed the ruling elite to provide the benefit of cloth for clothing, bags, wraps, and other adornments. Along with cotton, the other main agricultural items grown by the Norte Chico were gourds, which were also inedible but used for storage and as floats for fishing nets. As for actual edible produce, the Norte Chico domesticated potatoes, cereals, and other crops in the nearby Andean highlands. As the population grew, highland farmers learned to terrace their hillsides to increase the area of arable land. The Norte Chico were also the first civilization to domesticate alpacas and llamas for use as beasts of burden, a role they continue to serve even today. Norte Chico civilization was entirely lacking in ceramics. This not only eliminates a potential source of durable art, but also suggests that they had to roast all their food, lacking pots in which to boil it. Norte Chico art appeared to be limited to textiles, although the discovery of several dozen pelican bone flutes suggests that they may have also played music. Furthermore, the discovery of Quipu, string-based recording devices, at the Norte Chico site of Caral suggests that a writing, or at least proto-writing system, may have existed in the Norte Chico. The exact use of Quipu in this and later Andean cultures has been widely debated. Originally, they were thought to be simple mnemonics used to record numeric information, such as accounts of items bought or sold, kind of like an early string-based abacus. However, evidence has emerged suggesting that the Quipu may have also recorded symbols representing words, similar to writing. Research has primarily focused on the much larger sample of a few hundred Quipu dating to much later Inca times. For the moment, the Norte Chico Quipu discovery at Caral remains both unique and mysterious. Without a doubt, the strongest legacy of the Norte Chico is their monumental architecture, which included large terraced pyramids and sunken circular plazas. This construction, combined with large stone warehouses found at one site, implies the presence of a ruling elite wielding considerable power, perhaps through control over vital resources such as cotton. Architecture at Norte Chico sites is also notable for the absence of any type of defensive fortifications. This, along with other evidence, points to a lack of warfare in Norte Chico society. Settlement patterns also appear to be completely non-defensive in nature. Norte Chico sites are also notable for their large individual size and high collective density. Such a density of sites within such a small area, the three principal valleys contain over 30 major population centers within an area of only 700 square miles, is globally unique for an early human civilization. During the 3rd millennium BC, the Norte Chico may have been the most densely populated area in the world, possibly with the exception of northern China. As far as we can tell, Norte Chico rule was theocratic in nature, similar to early Sumer. The power of leaders was based on perceived access to deities and the supernatural. An image of the staff god, a leering figure with a hood and fangs, was found on a Norte Chico gourd dated to 2250 BC, making it the oldest image of a god found in the Americas. This figure, along with other religious symbols found at Norte Chico sites, would reappear in later pre-Columbian Andean cultures. The act of architectural construction and maintenance may also have held spiritual or religious significance for the Norte Chico. There's some evidence that Caral, for example, was considered a sacred city, and considerable resources were spent to periodically remodel the temples. Whatever form of government the Norte Chico used, it's pretty clear, based on the era and geographic isolation, that they came up with it entirely on their own. In fact, the Norte Chico is one of only 2 sites in the world where the concept of government is known to have emerged independently, the other being Sumer, with Mesoamerica being a third and much later case. In all other societies across the ancient world, the idea of forming a government, of developing a structure to manage resources and organize the population, was likely borrowed or copied to some extent from neighboring civilizations. Ruled by priests, ruled by big men, ruled by an oligarchy, or a more egalitarian approach. The correct relationship of the gods to one another, and to the land and resources upon which they depended for their livelihood. All of this had to be approached by the Norte Chico, as by the Sumerians, without reference to prior or contemporary examples. After thriving in virtual isolation for over 1,000 years, Norte Chico civilization finally declined around 1800 BC, with more powerful regional centers emerging to both the south and north along the coast, as well as in the Andes to the east. Norte Chico's success at irrigation-based agriculture may have contributed to its being eclipsed, as the construction of canals moved to more fertile ground away from the former Norte Chico heartland. Following the decline of the Norte Chico, it would be another 1,000 years before the rise of the next great Peruvian culture, the Chavin. But that's a story for a later podcast. Now, let's travel back across the Atlantic to check in on Neolithic, or New Stone Age Britain. The sad truth is, we know very, very little about the earliest inhabitants of the British Isles. In many ways, even less than we do about the Norte Chico. However, one thing we do know is that they were really into massive earthworks. The construction of the earliest earthwork sites began during the early Neolithic period in Britain, between 4400 and 3300 BC, and took 2 main forms: long mounds called barrows, used for communal burial, or causewayed enclosures, used to cross wetlands or bodies of water. A notable example of the latter is the Sweet Track, a wooden trackway built across local marshes, which has been dated to 3800 BC. The culture that built the Sweet Track also left behind stone houses, leaf-shaped arrowheads, pottery, and evidence of polished axe production. Not quite enough to classify as a civilization, but at least we're getting somewhere. The Middle Neolithic period in Britain, between 3300 and 2900 BC, saw the development of cursus monuments, large parallel lengths of banks with external ditches, located close to the earlier barrows. This period also saw the growth and subsequent abandonment of causewayed enclosures and the building of impressive chamber tombs. Perhaps most significantly, this period also saw the emergence of the first stone circles. During the late Neolithic period, between 2900 and 2200 BC, the earliest stone enclosures, known as henges, were built, including the famous sites at Stonehenge, Avebury, and Silbury Hill. The first evidence of long-distance trade also appears during this period, particularly between ancient Britain and the early peoples of the Iberian Peninsula. So let's talk Stonehenge for a bit. The site is located at the center of the most dense complex of Neolithic and later Bronze Age monuments in England, including several hundred burial mounds. Built of stone, as its name suggests, Stonehenge is arranged in a solar orientation, with the northeastern entrance aligned with the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset, and was constructed in several phases. The surrounding circular earth bank and ditch, which constitute the earliest phase of the monument, have been dated to around 3100 BC. During the most ambitious period of construction, between 2600 and 2400 BC, 30 enormous sarsen stones were erected on the site. Each one was 13 feet high, 7 feet wide, and weighed around 25 tons, with a ring of 30 lintel stones resting on top. During the same period, a large wooden circle, sometimes referred to as Woodhenge, was also constructed 2 miles away at Durrington Walls, overlooking the River Avon, and a long avenue was built connecting the two sites. The Durrington Circle, the largest henge in Britain, at over a quarter-mile in diameter, was oriented toward the midwinter sunrise, opposite the solar alignment at Stonehenge, while the avenue between the two sites was aligned with the midsummer sunset and led from the timber circle down to the river. Evidence of huge fires on the banks of the Avon suggests that both circles were linked and perhaps used as a procession route on the longest and shortest days of the year. It has also been speculated that Woodhenge represented a land of the living, while Stonehenge represented a land of the dead, with the Avon serving as a journey between the two. Unfortunately, since the architects of Stonehenge left no written records, the enigmatic monuments and related archaeological finds provide us with our only knowledge of the early people of Neolithic Britain. For the moment, in the immortal words of Nigel Tufnell, no one knows who they were or what they were doing. Now, let's move on from the periphery of Europe into warmer Mediterranean climes, move forward from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age. Last episode, I briefly mentioned the Sumerian inauguration of the Bronze Age around 3000 BC. Since this is the era we'll be living in for the next several podcasts, I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss the term in a little more detail. The Bronze Age is the period between roughly 3000 BC and 1100 BC in the Near East, Southern Europe, and India. It lasted somewhat longer in Northern Europe and the Far East. A given region entered the Bronze Age when it either learned to smelt its own copper and alloy it with tin to make bronze, or when it began trading for bronze produced elsewhere. Since copper and tin ores were rare and therefore highly valuable, their acquisition often formed the basis for regional trade networks spanning great distances. Such networks facilitated the cultural exchange between early civilizations, while also making local elites who exercised control over trade very, very rich. We discussed this in the context of the Sumerians last episode, but the scenario is generally applicable. Due to the longevity, popularity, and sheer artistry of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the most familiar Bronze Age civilizations to us today are probably the Mycenaean Greeks and the Trojans of Asia Minor. While these legendary combatants come to us from the tail end of the Bronze Age, I wanted to take the rest of this episode to discuss an early Bronze Age civilization whose culture would be a strong influence on the Mycenaean Greeks. It also just happens to be the earliest known European civilization, and one of my personal favorites, the Minoans of ancient Crete. I really loved the Minoans. Pretty much ever since I first saw the amazing artwork from their colony of Akrotiri on the Greek island of Thera around a dozen years ago. Lively, colorful, exuberant, natural, playfully athletic, into drinking wine, jumping over bulls, and plying the open seas with their trading ships full of exotic goods. The Minoans just seemed like they would be a lot of fun to hang out with. The fact that they never practiced warfare gave women powerful roles in their society, and to top it off, were the first ancient civilization to be brought down by a natural disaster that just made them all the more interesting. So now, let's get to know the Minoans a little bit better. The island of Crete has been populated and repopulated by various peoples from mainland Europe and the Near East down through the millennia. But it wasn't until around 5000 BC that the first signs of advanced agriculture appeared, particularly in the area of the fertile Messara Plain in the island's south, marking the beginning of what we call Minoan Civilization. By the way, the term Minoan was coined by Arthur Evans in the 20th century, after King Minos of Greek myth. You might remember him as the guy who kept a minotaur in a labyrinth beneath his palace, at least until the Greek heroes took care of business. Anyway, Evans thought the layout of Knossos was pretty maze-like, and combined with other archaeological evidence, he decided he'd found the legendary palace where the myth originated. Regardless of the strength of his argument, the name stuck. Since their own written records remain undeciphered, whatever the Minoans may have called themselves is still a mystery. As usual, we need to start with agriculture. The Minoans grew wheat, barley, grapes, figs, and olives, as well as poppies for poppy seed and perhaps opium. They also developed the practice of growing more than one crop at a time, known as polyculture, resulting in a more varied and healthy diet and an associated increase in population. This method of farming also helped maintain the fertility of the soil and offered protection against low yields of any single crop. Somewhat surprisingly for an island-based culture, the Minoans weren't really big on seafood. Instead, it appears that cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats provided the bulk of their diet. They also domesticated bees and adopted pomegranates and quinces from the Near East. In addition to agriculture and livestock, the Minoans produced three highly valuable goods for both domestic use and for export. The first was wine, fermented from local grapes. Wine had been produced since at least 5000 BC in the Zagros Mountains near the Elamite civilization we discussed last week, and even earlier than that in Central Asia, and probably made its way to Crete by way of the Balkans. But it was in Crete that the production and consumption of wine first became closely tied with the culture and ceremony of an ancient civilization, a place it would continue to occupy in the Greek and Roman worlds for the next few thousand years. The second item was olive oil, so highly esteemed in the ancient world that it was called liquid gold centuries later by Homer. High in both fat and calories, but without any adverse health effects, olive oil could be stored easily and stay fresh for up to a year. In other words, until the next harvest. In addition to its use as food, olive oil was also used in religious rituals, medicines, in oil lamps, for soap making, and for skincare application. The third item was cloth. Flocks of sheep pastured in the high mountains produced sufficient wool to supply a thriving textile industry. In addition to these three main items, dyes, pottery, and metalwork were also highly prized. Having entered the Bronze Age around 2700 BC, Minoan metalsmiths wasted no time honing their craft. Over the following centuries, several island localities developed into major centers of metalwork, producing jewelry, tableware, and other finely crafted items of bronze, gold, and silver for Minoan elites as well as for trade. With all these export items in abundance, it's really no surprise that by around 2000 BC, Minoan society had grown to be mainly mercantile in nature, focusing on Mediterranean seafaring trade. The coastal locations of many ancient sites on Crete, combined with a large number of workshops and the richness of archaeological finds, reflect an outward-looking society with its wealth built mainly on import and export. Trade-related activities also figure prominently in period wall frescoes, which depict large flotillas of trading vessels bound for distant shores. While many ancient civilizations of this era built boats to traverse rivers or hug coastlines, the Minoans designed ships with deep keels and high prows to ply the open ocean. These ships and the valuable cargo they carried helped make the Minoans into masters of both Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean trade. Objects of Minoan manufacture suggest that at the height of their influence, a trade network had been established with mainland Greece, notably Mycenae, Cyprus, Syria, Anatolia, modern Turkey, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and westward as far as the coast of Spain. Minoan artwork has been found in the city of Avaris in the eastern Nile Delta, home of the Hyksos invaders who would conquer Egypt in 1720 BC. Sorry, should have said spoiler alert. In late 2009, Minoan-style frescoes and related artifacts were discovered during excavations of the Canaanite palace at Tel Kabri in modern-day Israel, leading archaeologists to conclude that Minoan culture had a strong influence on that early Canaanite city-state. In addition to their wide-ranging trade networks, the Minoans also founded colonies, including one on the nearby island of Thera, or Santorini, another on the island of Kythera near the Greek mainland, and another on the island of Rhodes near Anatolia. It almost goes without saying that all of this trade and colonization served to spread Minoan culture widely throughout the region. And luckily for everyone they came in contact with, that culture just happened to be awesome. Minoan art, which has mostly come down to us in the more durable forms of pottery and wall frescoes, is lively, colorful, and exuberant, and seems to depict a civilization that rejoiced in the natural world without being overly preoccupied with the afterlife. One of the most famous frescoes, the bull-leaping scene from the Minoan palace at Knossos, shows men and women together engaged in festive, acrobatic sports. Other artwork celebrates the beauty of native plants and animals. Human figures were drawn in profile but with a frontal eye, with dark skin used to represent males, while white skin was used for females whose lives were more typically spent indoors. In these two aspects, Minoan art clearly reflects Egyptian influence. However, in all other respects, the depictions are wholly different and original. This suggests that the Minoans were familiar with Egyptian art, but chose to borrow from it only those aspects they liked. The Minoans used a written language called Linear A, which has never been deciphered. It appears to have been used primarily for administrative purposes, and was written on clay tablets and stored in archives. It is possible that the Minoans developed Linear A independently, making them another of the very few places in the world where written language originated. There is also some possibility that Minoan knowledge of Egyptian hieroglyphics may have contributed to the script's development. For the moment, the jury is still out. In terms of religion, the Minoans were polytheistic and worshipped mainly female deities, including a mother goddess of fertility and a mistress of the animals, with priestesses officiating at their religious ceremonies. Minoan sacred symbols included the bull, the serpent, and the labris, the double-headed axe, which originated in Crete and was commonly associated with the sacrifice of bulls. As a side note, the term labyrinth has its roots in the word labris, and the palace at Knossos may have also been known as the House of the Double Axe, another link between Cretan culture and the legend of King Minos. In terms of Minoan society, archaeological evidence points to relative equality between the sexes, with females exercising control over the religious sphere as well as over family inheritance, while males dominated the local oligarchies that governed early Minoan society. Despite the presence of a wealthy aristocracy, Minoan society was not highly stratified. The presence of multi-room structures, even in poorer areas of town, implies relative social equality and an equitable distribution of wealth. Minoan infrastructure was also fairly advanced. Cities were connected to one another with stone-paved roads formed from blocks cut with bronze saws. Streets were drained, and water and sewer facilities were available using clay pipes. In addition, the palace at Knossos had the earliest, the most ancient example of a working flush toilet system ever uncovered in Europe. Dates back to this period. The 20th century BC marked a period of weakening power for the local oligarchies, and the corresponding rise of the first Minoan kings. This development, in turn, spurred the construction of the first major Minoan palaces at Knossos, Malea, and Phaistos. It's largely due to this construction boom that the period between 1900 and 1700 BC is now recognized as the proto-palatial, or Old Palace period. Typical features of these palaces included columns, staircases, water basins, and an overall layout that was dictated by the specific topography of the area. These palaces served numerous important functions, acting as centers of government, administrative headquarters, religious shrines, artisan workshops, and storehouses that held massive pottery jars. These jars were brimming with surplus amounts of grain, olive oil, wine, and a variety of other valuable goods. The large, open central courtyards were most likely the setting for important religious rituals and large communal feasts. These surplus goods were likely managed and then redistributed by the Minoan kings, which is precisely why the proto-palatial period is often described as operating under a palace economy. Ceremonies and spectacles, such as the famous bull-leaping events, would draw people in from all over the countryside. The Minoan rulers would then distribute goods to them, providing incentive for their continuing agricultural labor. This labor was mainly focused on cultivating the Mediterranean triad of wine grapes, olives, and grain, both for local consumption and to be used for profitable export. Whatever the fine details may be, this system seemed to be effective and allowed the Minoan culture to prosper and flourish. Much like the Norte Chico civilization, the noticeable lack of defensive walls and fortifications at Minoan sites strongly suggests an absence of widespread armed conflict and strife under Minoan rule. However, this evidence is not necessarily conclusive in either situation. We know that, among several ancient civilizations, the Shang dynasty in China and the Maya civilization both had unfortified central areas, even while they were actively involved in various frontier struggles. Nevertheless, the actual evidence we have for Minoan warfare is exceptionally sparse. Minoan artwork is almost entirely devoid of any combat scenes, and whenever weapons happen to be depicted, it's clearly within a ceremonial or ritual context. Furthermore, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever of a dedicated Minoan army, nor is there any evidence of Minoan domination over other peoples outside of Crete. This stands in stark contrast to other contemporary civilizations in the Near East and North Africa, where such aggression is very well documented in the historical record. So, for the moment at least, let's allow the Minoans to remain in peace and continue to enjoy the beautiful Greek island life for a little while longer. As you've probably picked up on during our discussion of the Minoans in this episode and the Sumerians in the previous episode, what we're observing here is essentially the very beginning of two very different cultural traditions and differing worldviews. Minoan culture would later come to strongly influence the Mycenaean Greeks, and the various myths and tales of these legendary ancestors would go on to inspire the Dorian and Ionian people of classical Greece. On the opposing side, the long succession of Near Eastern cultures that followed the Sumerian and later Akkadian examples would find their ultimate expression in the Assyrian and Persian empires. It's perhaps inevitable that these two significantly different civilizations would eventually face off against one another in a defining conflict, a conflict that would eventually mark the end of the ancient world and give birth to the classical age. With our discussion of the Norte Chico civilization this episode, we've now completed our initial roster of the very first human civilizations that emerged across the entire globe in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. Additionally, with the Minoans, we've also now moved forward into the Bronze Age and witnessed the growing interaction and intermingling among the early civilizations of the Mediterranean region in the late 3rd millennium. Next time, we'll return to the Near East during the same general time period, and we'll witness the forging of what would become the world's first true empire under a legendary conqueror, whose remarkable deeds and ambitious aspirations would continue to inspire the rulers of the region for the next 2,000 years. Meet Sargon the Great, next time on The Ancient World. With the emergence of Norte Chico and Minoan, we have now completed our roster of the first independent human civilizations across the globe. This is where great cultural traditions began to diverge, ultimately leading to the defining conflict that would shape the modern world.